In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. So nice to be with you here, episode 113, coming to you from the Defenders Media office in West Chicago, Illinois, the western suburbs. Sometimes when I tell people I live in West Chicago, they think the western part of the city. That would be kind of cool, except, I don't exactly want to live in an urban atmosphere. No, we are about an hour outside of the city of Chicago. And but speaking of Chicago, you should come visit our city in a few weeks, because September 28 and 29, we are hosting the annual Defenders Conference, and this year's theme is on divine genocide. Did God really command the Israelites to kill even the women and the children? We're bringing in 4 different evangelical perspectives on this, and it's really going to be a fascinating time for you to sit and learn, and there will be breakout sessions, of course, on different topics. We've got the breakout sessions listed now up at the website, thedefendersconference.com. Hotel options available. Just this past week, we had 6 high school teachers from Louisville, Kentucky register for the event, so we're very excited about that. We've got a family from Oklahoma, a couple from Virginia. So if you're thinking, hey, what's there to do in Chicago? The last weekend in September, I will tell you what the best thing to do in Chicago is. And the event will be hosted at the Christian Church of Clarendon Hills, just about 30 minutes outside of the city. The Cubs might be playing as well at Wrigley, so maybe if you stick around on Sunday, you can take in a beautiful Cubs game, drinking a Dr. Pepper, of course, at Wrigley Field. I know our guest today is a big fan of Dr. Pepper. He hails from Houston, Texas. Today, we are talking about street epistemology. And what is street epistemology? Well, it's this growing movement of atheist evangelism. That's how I would sort of describe it. There's been sort of a small evolution on that a little bit. Our guest certainly knows more about it. He is none other than Cameron Bertuzzi. He is the founder of Capturing Christianity, a aesthetically, visually stunning website and apologetic ministry that Cameron has started not too long ago, just a couple years ago, and it's a great website. I want to encourage everyone to go check that out. We'll be sure to put the link in our thread today. I want to welcome those that are watching online. If you have comments or questions, we'll be keeping track of those, and actually before we have our guest join us, I want to say in studio here we have a panelist, if we can call him that. AJ, my essay, is a Wheaton College graduate student. AJ, thanks for sticking around here on our show today. He gave us the thumbs up. He'll be keeping track of those comments and questions, and sometimes I drop the ball on that stuff. So if you do have a comment or question, AJ will be letting us know. So, cool. All right, Cameron Bertuzzi. I mispronounced his name last week, and so I apologize for that. Thanks for joining us on our program today.
Hey, it's great to be here, Kurt. It's also good to meet you in person. We've been talking a lot.
We have, yeah.
Text and phone, so it's great to meet you. And we're using Skype, so your face is like super small. I don't know. So it's a little strange to see you so small over here on the screen. But anyways, thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me on your show.
Yeah.
And all the nice things that you said about our website. I mean, that's what we try to do is I'm a photographer. That's my background. So
you got to have a good looking website and good looking material.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or at least I try to. I mean, otherwise it wouldn't make much sense to be calling that out. So.
Yeah. By the way, Christianity is true.
By the way, I don't know if you guys knew that.
For those that are following Cameron on social media, Cameron, how did I describe this? Your style of engagement, especially dealing with trolls, is actually very. It's good. It's a good type of response. I need to do a search here. I thought I put it well. I used the word sassy.
You did. The way that you described it, I thought was really accurate, actually.
Ah, man, I'll have to find it later.
Oh, it's okay. I'm not always proud of the way that I interact with trolls, but in it kind of is just like a really straightforward to the point. I like being succinct in general. So I sort of translated that into some of the comments and the images that we post on social media and stuff. We just sort of get right to the point. And even including like we sell these T-shirts on our website. And so I don't know if you guys can see this. It says, by the way, Christianity is true. That's just, it's a way of engaging and starting a dialogue about the truth of Christianity. And I usually accompany that with like a post or a talk that I did on the resurrection. So it's not just like this thing that we're saying, hey, just go believe this, but it's a sort of a conversation starter.
Yeah.
So
nice. Great. Okay. Before we jump into street epistemology, and there, you talked about your shirts have this dialogue aspect. It's a good dialogue starter, and that's what street epistemology is about. Tell me first about your background and your interest in apologetics.
So my interest in apologetics started a few years ago now, and I always forget how many, but it was about 5 to 6, I would say, at this point. 5 to 6 years ago, I learned that my brother became an atheist, and that really took me by surprise. I wasn't expecting that to happen. We had grown up in church, gone to church.
Everybody in the South is a Christian.
Yeah. Well, most people. But I was not expecting that because I had gone through a period of doubt when I went to Bible school, actually. I was like, did Jesus even exist? These are some of the thoughts that I had in Bible school. And so I sort of overcame some of those doubts. I looked at some of the evidence. All I did was basically look at Josephus. And I was like, yeah, that seems like that's enough for me. Yeah. So my story is a lot different than his. He took it very seriously. He started to look into like some of the arguments on Reddit. He watched a few documentaries, and that's the conclusion that he came to. So when I learned this, I was like, well, I probably need to learn more about this and figure out what I can do to help maybe take him away from his atheism, because, that's an important thing. So I met with him, and the conversation didn't go at all how I planned. I had very bad answers to his questions and to his objections. So that sent me on a journey to figure out, why do I believe first that Christianity is true? Are there good reasons to think that it's true? And as I started to get into this, I found a sort of love and a passion for apologetics, and that sort of developed into Capturing Christianity, what you see on our website and everything that we do. We even host live discussions between Christians and non-Christians on our YouTube channel. I love all this stuff. So that's the background story on who I am and why I'm doing this stuff as a photographer. I'm a layman. I haven't gone to school for any of this stuff. I just like to read books.
Yeah, well, sometimes people pay money to read books, and other times people just pay a little bit of money to read books. So, all right. So tell me about your interest then in the so-called, I guess I kind of call it so-called street epistemology, because, they're not really epistemologists. It is a form, I guess everyone has an epistemology, and it does happen on the street. So tell us how you got interested in this and also what it is.
Okay. So yeah, they're not epistemologists. They're street epistemologists, and it's a bad name. But before that, my interest in street epistemology sort of began about a year ago now, a little over a year ago maybe. I saw a video posted by Jonathan McClatchy. I don't know if you've had him on your show yet.
Not yet.
He's engaged with street epistemologists, and I saw a video that he posted of him dialoguing with the street epistemologist on his YouTube channel, and I was like, this is crazy. And so you guys can watch it actually. I don't know if you want to put that in the notes or whatever for the show, but it's an interesting watch because Jonathan comes from a very he comes from a very evidentialist point of view.
Yeah.
So anyways, interesting. And that's what got me started in the street epistemology. I was like, well, because I had actually, so a few years ago, Peter Boghossian, who's the founder of street epistemology, debated Timothy McGrew. And I'm hoping that most of your listeners know who he is. He's a Christian philosopher, excellent guy. Well, I guess you have actually had him on your show before, so
yes.
So most people should be aware of who he is. But anyways, so they had a dialogue. Peter Boghossian, Timothy McGrew had a dialogue on the Unbelievable show in 2013, I think. So this was several years ago now. And you could say that Timothy had sort of an upper hand in that conversation. So I wasn't really, beyond listening to that episode, I wasn't like, okay, street epistemology is going to be this thing that is going to require some kind of sophisticated Christian response. But then, about a year ago, I see that, hey, street epistemologists actually have a movement now. And so it's something that needs to be taken seriously in that respect. It's like it's having some kind of impact in the culture. So it needs to have several point of views, I think, not just the evidentialist point of view, but also this other point of view that I think is true, what's called reformed epistemology. We don't need to go in that today, but I just wanted to sort of address street epistemology from my point of view and sort of give some more insight into another Christian's take on it, so to speak. So that's how I got my start into it. And we can go into what it is if you want to do that.
Yeah, so Boghossian wrote this book called A Manual for Creating Atheists, and this is sort of what took off the street epistemology movement. It's been a way for people to learn how to ask skeptical and stumping questions of Christians who don't know how to explain why they have Christian faith other than just kind of some sort of subjective experience or something like that. So it's cast doubt for a lot of Christians when they've engaged with atheists. And in fact, I've heard one story where there was a pastor who was obviously unprepared to be pastoring because he deconverted from the Christian faith and became an atheist as a result of engaging with so-called street epistemologists. And so that's been a real shame. It has been a movement, though. So, Cameron, why don't you tell us a little bit more about them?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to quote from the book that you mentioned, A Manual for Creating Atheists. This is on page 1. It says, quote, "The goal of this book is to create a generation of street epistemologists, people equipped with an array of dialectical and clinical tools who actively go into the streets, the prisons, the bars, the churches, the schools, and the community, into any and every place the faithful reside, and help them abandon their faith and embrace reason." And again, that's on page 1. So you could say that, like you mentioned at the outset, it's sort of like atheistic evangelism. They want to instill doubt in people. And when you instill doubt in someone about a specific belief, i.e. Christianity, then you're doing some kind of atheistic evangelism. Or if not atheistic evangelism, then sort of agnostic evangelism.
Yeah,
but here's
some deep skepticism.
Right. Yeah, skepticism about Christianity. And in some cases it works. Like you mentioned, there are cases where people have either completely deconverted or they're starting to doubt about Christianity. And there's reasons for that. But let me give another quote, which is going to help provide a little bit more background and the sort of tone that Boghossian sets. And this it's interesting. Well, anyways, let me just quote it here. So this is on page 56, quote, "You will, in a very real sense, be administering a dialectical treatment to your conversational partners in a similar way that drug addicts receive treatment for drug abuse. Drug addicts come into the detox center in state X, undergo treatment, and then leave the facility in state Y, hopefully improved. You will not be treating drug addicts. You will be treating people who have been infected with the faith virus." Right. And this kind of stuff is interesting because it's not, I mean, this is a direct quote from the book, and this is setting the tone, which is, it's sort of weird, right? So it's a weird tone to set. You're painting these people as these people that are infected with this faith virus. But that's the basic rundown of sort of what street epistemology is, and we can get into the nitty-gritty details beyond that if you want to.
Yeah, and also I think it would be important to say that Boghossian himself is not an epistemologist. From what I remember from that McGrew debate, he has a PhD in education, I think, and he's not a philosopher. He doesn't have a faculty position in philosophy. So the words that you're hearing from Cameron are not from a philosopher. They are from...
Well, no, I think he is a philosopher.
Is he?
Teaches. I think he teaches philosophy. I'm not sure his background completely, so I don't want to put stuff on him that he's not actually, so I don't know.
I will look this up in the course of our conversation. But could you... Okay, so we're talking here about street epistemology, and I'd like to get an example of something they might say. You know what? He is a professor of philosophy at Portland State University. But from what I remember, he doesn't have a PhD in that area. Maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong. I will look this up. Okay, so what is an example of someone, I mean, how do you know, if I'm walking on the street, how can I know, oh, I'm dealing with a street epistemologist?
Okay, so this should be relatively easy to tell because most of the time these guys are filming themselves. And what they do is they go out and they have like a GoPro strapped to their chest or some kind of recording device. It may even just be audio. But what they'll do is they'll say, well, hey, I just want to interview you about some deeply held belief that you have. And then in the course of like offering different beliefs that could be under discussion, they'll offer in a sort of suggestive way, hey, we could discuss, if you're a Christian, we could discuss that. Or if you're a Mormon, we could discuss that belief. It's a deeply held belief. So that's sort of the way that you would tell sort of up at the front that it's a kind of interview. They say, I just want to interview about this subject. And so you could maybe tell from that. But as the course of the conversation goes, you'll definitely be able to tell at some point. They even have a PDF of like a script, a breakdown of all the questions that you should ask, what to say, how to respond, and all that stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's relatively easy to tell if you get some familiarity with what they do. And I recommend, like, if you are really interested in street epistemology and how to respond to it, like, go read that PDF. I actually have it linked on my website. I have an article that's titled "How to Respond to Street Epistemology." It's almost at 10,000 views actually, but at the very end of that, I've hyperlinked the PDF, and you can download like that. You can read it.
A 38-page PDF or something like that, right?
And it's constantly being updated, which is an interesting point to make. They don't just make these updates willy-nilly. They have like a council of people who sit down and talk and make decisions about what changes need to be made. And what's funny is that they've just recently decided that, hey, we need to provide a section on epistemology in their guide. Make of that what you will, but
all right. Yeah. So how would a conversation go?
Okay, so the way that they start it is they ask you what you believe, and they want to figure out the specific belief in question. They want to discuss something, and usually it's like Christianity or something along those lines. Most of the conversations that you hear, like they have a street epistemology podcast. Most of the episodes they do are on Christianity or some religious claim. They'll sometimes talk about karma or like different political beliefs, which the method can work on those too, because people are just generally not very thoughtful, critical thinkers, the average person on the street. So anyways, so the first thing they do, first question is, what do you believe? And so if you're a Christian, you're going to say, I believe in Christianity. And so the next question is usually, what is your level of confidence? And they try to give a scale of like a 0 to 100. Are you 0? Do you have all doubts about Christianity? Or are you at 100%? Are you all confidence, no doubt? And so they want you to place a specific number on your level of confidence that Christianity is true. That's one of the big giveaways too, if you're trying to figure out if you're dealing with a street epistemologist, is they'll ask for your level of confidence. And there's a couple reasons why they do that. Number one is they want to gauge from the beginning to the end, hey, did you move at all in your confidence level? And so what that means in practical terms is, how much doubt have I instilled in this person? Are they still at 99% or 100%, or have they sort of come back a little bit? Are they down to say 80% or 60%, or have they given it up? Which most of the time in a course of one conversation, you're not going to give it up completely. But that's one of the reasons that they give, that they want to get your confidence level. To me, I think that it actually comes to play later on in the discussion when they start to ask for your figures and stuff. It's a sort of rhetorical thing, and they may not be aware of this and they may not be using it in that way, but it does sort of give some kind of advantage in certain situations. So that's question number 2. Again, question 1 is, what is the belief? Question 2 is, what's your level of confidence? And then question 3 is normally something like, well, how did you determine that your belief is true? And so at this point, I mean, do you want me to give like how I think people should respond, or should we just go through like the questions that they'll ask you?
Not quite yet. Yeah, just the questions that they would ask.
So that's the third question.
We've got to leave our listeners waiting until the second half of the program so they know how to.
Okay. All right. So that's question 3 is how did you determine that your belief is true? And then the last question, which is, and this is not like they don't ask these questions in this order and every time. It's not like this methodical method. It is sort of, this is more of like a general broad outline of how the conversation goes. And they'll ask variations of these questions. So it's not like they don't read these questions literally from a script, but it's an outline, a sort of guide to what should happen. And so this is the last question. This is like the meat of the question that they want to get to. This is how they start to introduce doubt. Question number 4 is faith a reliable method of determining that a belief is true? And some variations of this look like, well, hey, if a Muslim came up to me and told me that they believe in Allah because of faith, well, how could we determine which of you guys is true? Or they might ask it this way as well. So does just believing in something give you knowledge? Or like, is that a good way of getting to 99% or 100%? Is just believing in something a good way to do that? So those are some variations of that last question. But those are the 4 main, I would say, questions that they ask. And then from there, you get all sort of silly responses from really both sides. Because these guys, as you said, they're not epistemologists. They're not really familiar with the literature. So it's basically just a couple of non-experts going at this really deep subject. Actually, if you look into it, you read the literature. So, yeah, there's a lot of confusion on both sides. And it looks like only one of them is confused, but in reality, both of them are sort of fumbling their way through. And I'm only saying this because the people that they interview are not experts. For the most part, sometimes you'll see them interview an apologist. And there's only really a couple guys that actually do that. The main guy who does street epistemology, his name is Anthony Magnabosco. He avoids those conversations with professionals. So he makes it a point to go and have discussions with average people who are uninformed. The person who just goes to church and goes to worship and maybe goes to Bible study occasionally, that's the person that he targets.
Speaking of experts, you mentioned that. So Boghossian was actually kicked out of a philosophy PhD program at New Mexico State University. Let's see here. It's a press release from their website. Dr. Peter Boghossian is a full-time faculty member in Portland State University's philosophy department. He was thrown out of the doctoral program in the University of New Mexico's philosophy department. So I'm fairly confident he's got a PhD in education, which nevertheless, I mean, he is still publishing in this area. So it's still, worth engaging in.
Well, actually, let me just sort of correct that. So he's not really doing this kind of stuff anymore. He's sort of moved his focus, from what I understand, more to like he wants to attack liberalism, actually. So he's engaging a lot with social justice warriors and that kind of thing on Twitter. If you go to his Twitter and that's the kind of thing that he's changed his area of focus for now. Yeah. Maybe, so he's not really, I mean, he's still involved. I think that they just put out like the street epistemology community. Again, they have like a council of guys. There's a lot of ways in which street epistemology resembles a church, like a religious. Not even necessarily a church. It's a little cultish actually, which is it's a little strange. But so they put out this video recently. It's like this trailer about street epistemology, trying to sort of introduce it, and he actually played the role of somebody in that video. So he's still involved. He's sort of like the father of street epistemology, and I mean his book sort of started it. He coined the term. So he's involved, but not at the level that he was. His focus has moved on a little.
So what are some of the philosophical assumptions that street epistemologists have? So everyone sort of has their own epistemological framework. And by the way, if you've been following along and that word is unfamiliar with you, epistemology is simply the study of knowledge, so how we can know things. So everyone sort of has their own framework. But so where do street epistemologists come from then?
I don't want to speak for all of them, but from what I can tell, from what I can see, most of them are what's called hyper-evidentialists. And I want to use that term instead of just the regular term evidentialist, because when it really gets down to the literature and you start to really read stuff in epistemology, Evidentialism can mean a whole variety of things. And in some sense, I'm actually an evidentialist. So I want to use the term hyper evidentialist, which roughly means that your beliefs ought to be proportioned to the public evidence, the stuff that is publicly available to everybody. So it's not your memories that are providing justification, because no one has access to your memories, only you do. You only have access to your experiences. So what's publicly available, though, is what everyone's beliefs ought to be aligned with, and they ought to be proportioned in that way to that available evidence. Now, an interesting question that you can ask right away is, well, why believe that? Why would you want to adopt that kind of epistemology? And once you start to really look at it, there aren't a whole lot of arguments or reasons.
What's their confidence
that's
level
true.
in that?
What is your confidence? Yeah, what's your confidence level in this epistemological assumption that you're making here? But like I said, I don't want to sort of paint with too broadly a brush there, but it's inevitably going to come up because let me mention this. I think this is important to mention. There's a video that came out about a month ago, in that time frame. Anthony Magnabosco, again, he's one of the biggest guys in Street Epistemology. His YouTube channel, I think, has about 26,000 subscribes. So he had a talk that he did at this atheism conference. I forget the name of it, but the title of the talk is, quote, Street Epistemology, a turning point for atheism. And so if any of you have been on the fence about, well, is street epistemology really an atheistic thing? Yes, it is. He gave a talk on it a month ago, Street Epistemology, a turning point for atheism. And at the 50-second mark, he says this, quote, I think street epistemology is going to be critical to the success of atheism. That's a direct quote from him in the talk. And you can go give it a watch if you want to. But anyways, in this talk, he sort of lays out what street epistemology is. He's trying to teach these atheists the method and try to convince them that, hey, you need to adopt this method if you want to convert your family and your friends, because it's a little bit more cordial, it's more congenial. You're going to get people to actually start to question their beliefs instead of just combating them with these arguments and evidences that you think that you have for naturalism. That doesn't work. What you need to do is street epistemology. And so in the talk, he gives the basic breakdown of how street epistemology works, and he breaks it down. I'm going to say it's a two-step method. And so I already mentioned the sort of questions that get to the heart of these two steps. But the first step is to determine how that person came to believe whatever belief they hold. Specifically with Christianity, they want to determine how you came to that belief. It's easy as that. That's the step one. And so what he does is he uses the term epistemology sort of as synonymous with method. So when they want to say, I'm figuring out what your epistemology is, they're really saying, I want to find out what your method is, or what's the source of your justification for your belief. So that's step one, is to find out the method. And then the second thing he does is he wants to help the person reflect on whether or not that method is a reliable method for uncovering truth. So he wants that person to do some introspection, to ask themselves whether that method is reliable. So what he's really hoping is that through the course of this conversation, they're going to see that, hey, yeah, that method that I used isn't really a reliable method of truth. And what's interesting, we were talking about philosophical assumptions. It sounded like I was just going off on this tangent. So when they do that, this step two is to help them reflect on their epistemology. But the question here is, well, what is the street epistemologist doing at this point in that step two? Are they guiding the questions a certain way to help expose sort of whether or not they believe that their method is unreliable? And so it looks like that second step, they can say that they're not trying to do this, but that second step does give off the very strong sense that they are hyper-evidentialists, that view that we discussed earlier. So that's what I think is really going on in a lot of these discussions. And what's important to note as well, and I'll stop talking, what's important to note is that, again, these guys are not professional epistemologists. So when they're trying to evaluate your epistemology, your method that you used, they're not in a position really to know what's what about your method or the source of your justification for your beliefs. So they can think they know, and maybe in the course of the conversation it might seem intuitively that, hey, my method wasn't that great. But sometimes our intuitions about these types of philosophical matters are wrong. Sometimes there's arguments against them, which maybe we'll get into. So sometimes our intuitions can be wrong, even about something that seems so obvious. And you can think that that's sort of the lay person's, I think, position is something like hyper-evidentialism. So, but there are arguments against it. There are reasons to think it's not a good epistemology. So, yeah.
Great. I know this has been a lot. We're going to head to a short break here for a little bit. When we come back, though, we're going to talk more about how Christians can respond and the types of answers we can give in response to the 4 lines of questions that Cameron laid out. So be sure to stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Have you heard of the Google Ad Grant for nonprofits? 501c3 nonprofit organizations can receive $10,000 per month in online advertising credit from Google, empowering you to share your message with the world. At Defenders Media, we partnered with Nonprofit Megaphone, an agency focused solely on Google grant acquisition and management. They got us approved for the grant and now manage ad campaigns, bringing hundreds of new people to our websites each month. If you are eligible, Nonprofit Megaphone will acquire and manage the grant for you for a month for free to see if they can help you too. Visit nonprofitmegaphone.com to learn more. Thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you want to learn how you can become a sponsor or a patron, just an individual that might chip in a few bucks a month, head to our website, veracityhill.com, and click on that patron tab. Also, if you like our program, or I guess if you don't like our program, give us a review on Facebook, iTunes, and Google. We would love to get some of those search engine results generating more when people search for terms like apologetics or Christianity and politics, something like that. You know, we'd love to get be popping up there on the podcast suggestions for them. So, okay, we are talking with Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity, and on our show today, we're talking about street epistemology, which is a form of atheist evangelism. I know Cameron has listened to our show before, so he knows what's coming up next here. This is a segment of our program we like to call Rapid Questions. And if you are getting bored of some of these questions, I want to encourage you to submit new possibilities for us. We've got some of the questions we've had for a number of episodes now, but happy to change them out. I know one of the questions, I already know the answer that Cameron has, so I can answer that for him. So Cameron, I'm going to start the game clock here, and then I'll ask the first question. Are you ready?
I am ready, unfortunately.
All right, here we go. What's your clothing store of choice?
H&M.
Taco Bell or KFC?
Neither.
What school did you go to?
I went to the Art Institute.
What song is playing on your radio?
I listen to podcasts.
Where would you like to live?
I would like to live in New York.
What's your favorite sport?
My favorite sport is basketball.
What kind of razor do you use?
I use a Norelco, I think. It's a little electric razor.
What's your wife's favorite holiday?
Probably Christmas.
What fruit would you say your head is shaped like?
An apple.
Do you drink Dr. Pepper? The answer is yes. Have you ever driven on the other side of the road?
I was actually thinking about that one, and I don't think I have.
Pick a fictional character you'd like to meet.
I would like to meet Gandalf.
Which celebrity are you most like?
Ooh, pass.
Hokey Pokey, Electric Slide, or the Macarena?
Pass.
Ah. All right, Cameron, thank you for playing that round of rapid questions. All right, what podcasts are you listening to?
Oh, man, I need to pull it up. Well, there's one that I really like. I think it's called Capturing Christianity.
Right. Do you listen to your own? I have a hard time listening, going back on my own interviews.
Yeah, I think I listened maybe once, and maybe I won't listen to the whole thing. I'll just listen to part of it. But okay, I just pulled it up here. I have Case File, Conversations from the Blue Dot, Hardcore History, William Lane Craig's Defenders. I have Dogma Debate on here.
Yep.
What else? Hinge, The Making of. I think that's a really cool podcast. Real Atheology. Oh, this one is a really great one I wish people knew more about. The podcast of Moral Apologetics. That is a really great podcast. Reasonable Faith, the regular one. Rethinking Hell,
Yep.
Right Reason, Stand to Reason, the Street Epistemology
You got
podcast.
a lot.
Yeah, Ben Shapiro Show, the Bad Christian Podcast, the Briefing, Cold Case Christianity, the History of Christian Theology, Milo Yiannopoulos. Actually, I don't even listen to that. NT Wright Podcast, the Pat Flynn Show. I was interviewed on that recently. Gospel in Life, the True ID Podcast.
Oh my gosh, this list, I've got like 4 on my...
And Veracity Hill.
Yes, thank you. The best for last. No. Awesome. That is a big list of podcasts that you're listening to, for real.
It is. That's all I listen to. And
like
if I
on
could
your
listen to
commute
more, I would.
and...
Oh yeah, my commute, and then while I'm at work too. A lot of stuff that I shoot at work, I shoot as in I take photos of it.
Yeah.
Is very mundane. That work can get mundane, so I like to listen to podcasts, and if not a podcast, like an audiobook. So I have a few audiobooks I'm starting to get into. I listened to Cold Case Christianity one day, The Reason for God.
Yeah.
There's a few others.
Nice. You said your favorite sport's basketball.
Yes.
So you're a Houston Rockets fan?
Huge. I'm a big Rockets fan.
I am presently without a basketball team to root for because I have forsaken the Chicago Bulls because management has no idea what they're doing.
What's funny is I actually heard you mention that on one of the podcasts I was randomly picking out of your list there. I was like, let me just listen to this one. This one looks interesting. I don't remember which one it was.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that, and I was like, you should be a Rockets fan.
I'm happy to be recruited, so I'm open. At any
I
rate,
think we stand the biggest chance of beating the Warriors.
Well, even though the Warriors have superstars, a few years back, before they started winning the championships, I noticed they were playing like a team. They would pass the ball around. It's different than, say, a LeBron James team.
True.
That's one thing I liked about the Warriors. It was the passing. It was still a team sport. At any rate, okay, people are tuning in not to listen to us banter about sports and even podcasts, but street epistemology. That is the topic of today's program. Cameron has done some research, writing, and engagement with street epistemology, and so he is here to explain what it is and how we can be prepared to defend our faith. And so, what are some of the recommendations you might have for how Christians should respond to street epistemology?
Earlier in the show, I mentioned that article that I wrote. It's called How to Respond to Street Epistemology. So if you want to learn more about what I have to say, we can't cover everything now. I would say go check that article out because I link to a bunch of other articles that I've written that are related. So, but I don't want to just sort of reiterate or say the things that are already on that page because you can go read that. So I wanted to do something different today. I mentioned earlier before we went to the break that Anthony Magnabosco, he has a sort of 2-step process. So you find the method, and then you want to gauge or help them think about whether or not that method is reliable. What we can learn from this right off the bat is that if you have a reliable epistemology, then street epistemology doesn't actually work. It doesn't work at all. So suppose, for instance, the Christian in one of these interviews said that their belief was based on testimony, specifically the testimony of the biblical authors. Professional epistemologists, if you go to the epistemology, there's a website called Stanford, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, who philosophers are actually going on and they're writing these articles about these different subjects.
It's a great online encyclopedia of philosophy.
It is. And these guys write these articles like they're commissioned to write them. So they aren't just written by some random dude who's talking about these very intense subjects.
And they're objective. So they just describe. They don't necessarily prescribe. The author isn't telling you which view is the correct one, but it'll just help you understand the lay of the field.
Exactly. And what's also cool about it is that they'll do like a part where it's objections to this view and then responses to those objections, and they'll just sort of leave it up to you to sort of make your decision or judgment about it. But anyway, so I mentioned that because in the article on epistemology, they list 5 different sources of justification, and testimony is one of those. So anyways, going back to this Christian scenario, there's a guy named Richard Swinburne who I was able to interview on my YouTube channel. Just some random dude. Christian. He's an excellent Christian philosopher, and he's 82, I believe, and he's still sharp as a needle. Anyways.
He does not have a PhD, believe it or not.
He does not. I was shocked to find that. But he has something, I think, equivalent. This was before they were doing PhDs, apparently.
I think he only has an MA. I don't even think he has the DPhil. I mean, maybe he does now, but when he got started, even as a professor of philosophy at Oxford, he was just one of the sharpest brains on planet Earth. So.
Right. All right. So he says that unless we have some reason to doubt someone's testimony, what they tell us, then we ought to believe it. And rejecting this principle actually leads to skepticism. Think about the scientific knowledge that you have. Did you actually go out and perform the experiments? Did you go Pluto's in the news right now. Have you ever seen Pluto with your own eyes? There's pictures of it now, but suppose, okay, so that's maybe a bad example.
Photoshop.
Go back
Photoshopped.
before, yeah. It's been photoshopped, okay. Anyway, so a lot of our scientific knowledge, a lot of our knowledge more generally, is based on testimony. And so if we reject this kind of principle, we're going to be rejecting a lot of our knowledge. And so to rebut street epistemology, it's as easy as saying, my belief is based on testimony, the testimony of the biblical authors. And according to professional epistemologists, that's a reliable source of knowledge. So what are you going to say to that? Really what they can say at that point is to offer a defeater of that belief. And a defeater, in the language of epistemology, of the professionals, again, that just means a reason to think that your belief is false. So they'd have to provide then, the onus would be on them to, hey, let's find some kind of defeater for your belief in the testimony of the biblical authors. And so at that point, we would be, I think, needing to discuss the evidence, which is something they are not really comfortable doing. Street epistemologists, there's a section in the book, the original book, titled literally, quote, avoid facts. And this is based on some studies that have been done about how people, when they're presented facts and evidence, sometimes they'll actually get stronger, have stronger convictions that their belief is true. And so you don't want to actually talk about the facts. But there's been some recent research that suggests that that's actually false, that when presented evidence, people do generally update and change their beliefs, which is true. I mean, the evidence bears it out too. And the street epistemologists who are getting people to deconvert. So yeah, so that's what I would say. That's a different spin on a way to respond to street epistemology is to cite testimony. And I know you want to hit back on that. So
yeah. So and I just want to clarify too, maybe what we're talking about when we're talking about testimony. So what you're saying is, so let me give an example here. How do I know that the Earth is round? Well, when I was in school, I learned that the Earth rotates around the sun. And it does so in an orbit, and that it's a sphere. And I learned this in school, in a textbook. My teacher taught me it. So is that the type of thing that would provide justification to use?
It'd be a source of justification. Yeah, that's the basic way that it would go. Is that testimony acts as a source of justification. They tell you whatever they have to tell you, and then normally what happens under normal circumstances is that you form the belief that, hey, what they said was true, and that's a reliable source of it's a justified source of knowledge.
Now,
so yeah,
okay, so there are Mormons who say they have a testimony, and they believe that Joseph Smith is a prophet of God. They had a burning of the bosom experience upon reading the Book of Mormon. And does that mean that they are justified in their belief?
So according to Richard Swinburne's principle, it depends. Maybe that's the way to put it. So I'm looking over this way because I have his screen on this. screen, so hopefully that's not confusing to you guys watching. Well, anyway, so the Swinburnian principle of testimony would suggest actually that, hey, they might be justified so long as there's no reason to doubt whatever justification source they're pointing to. So if they're saying, well, hey, when I read the Book of Mormon, it seems true to me, it seems like this is a good, reliable source of testimony, they could, in fact, be justified. And I think what people have a problem with is that they don't want to allow for false beliefs to be justified. But again, when it comes to philosophy, and we're talking about these really highfalutin things, we got to actually realize that some of our intuitions that might seem like, hey, that's weird, sometimes there's good reason to sort of update and change.
And what you're saying here is that in the philosophical literature, it's widely accepted that a person could believe something that is wrong, that is factually wrong, and yet still be epistemologically justified or warranted for having that belief.
I don't want to use the term warranted.
Okay, sorry.
But I would say justified. Yeah. Because we could make a distinction.
Sure. Yeah.
But let me give an example of a justified false belief. So before we had the evidence, you mentioned a round earth. Before we had the evidence of a round earth, pretty much everybody thought the earth was flat. And that belief was not irrational for those people to hold. That's really what seemed to be the case. The earth really did seem flat. You look around, it just looks that way. So yeah, that's an example of like a false belief. Like you can have these justified false beliefs. That doesn't change anything. The question then would be, well, is this person actually justified? And I think, like I said, they are. Depends on the situation, the person, what they've done, the kind of objections there actually are, the evidence and stuff. So they can be justified, but then the question is, are there any defeaters for their belief? And so the case of Mormonism, we could say, well, hey, actually there are some defeaters of Mormonism. Or the atheist could say, hey, there's actually some defeaters of your belief in Christianity. So that's where the discussion would kind of turn to. I can talk about equal weight theory, actually, which is some people try to use this as a defeater itself. Well, hey, the disagreement here, Mormons and Christians and Muslims and Hindus, they all disagree, yet they have access to the same evidence. So that alone, religious disagreement alone, is enough to act as a defeater of religious belief. And we could talk about that, or we could move on, whatever you want to go.
We've got some questions online here that I'm seeing. We've got a question here from Jonathan Hanna. He asks, does hyper-evidentialism equal old verificationism? And I think the answer here would be no. There are some similarities. You know, a street epistemologist and a verificationist might be naturalists, for example, but it's not quite the same thing. Verificationism dealt with even the meaning of words, and that certain words were meaningless. And there was a similar.
I think that was more logical positivism, and maybe neither of you, I think, are experts in epistemology, so maybe it'd be better to avoid that question, because what do they mean by old verificationism?
Sure.
And then maybe that would be where I would go, is to ask them what they meant, because then at that point we could maybe evaluate. But yeah.
But roughly, I would say that there's still some difference here between street epistemology and verificationism, if I'm understanding, even a broad scope of these philosophical camps. They are
fair
distinct.
enough. Yeah, I think there's definitely going to be a distinction that can be made there. Yeah.
So maybe Jonathan, I'll follow up with you later this week, and we'll get some links out there and continue the conversation. Kyle here is asking about. Let's see, he's got a couple questions here. He's curious about the scope here, accessibility. Are we, he puts, scripting lay Christians to answer the scripted questions of lay atheists? So what's our intention here? I think that we're trying to, Kyle, that's a good question too. I think we're trying to raise awareness about a growing movement of atheists that are seeking to bring Christians out of the faith. And so recognizing what some of those questions are and how to respond to those questions, how to recognize the philosophical assumptions of the questioner can help to get around even the question and say, hey, is that even a fair question intellectually? So helping to prepare people can be important. So for example, when the street epistemologists will ask about that confidence level, 0 to 100. They might be implying that you need a very, very, very high level of confidence in order for something to be true. At least they might not say that explicitly, but they might be implying it. And sometimes we don't need a high level of certainty in order to be justified in our belief, to think that a belief is reliable. So even explaining those sorts of things can be very helpful for a Christian who might tomorrow be engaging with a street epistemologist. So very good question, though. Is that fair, Cameron? Is that a good example of?
Only thing I would add to that is that if the response that we're offering is like a valid response, I don't really see the issue. If it was the testimony route that I gave earlier, that seems like a really valid response to give. So if it's a valid, reasonable response, I don't really see the issue there. If it's a moral issue, or if whatever the issue ultimately boils down to, I don't really see one. It's not an intellectual issue, obviously, if it's a reasonable way to go. And if it's a reasonable way to go, then plausibly there's no moral issue to be had. And I mean, that's one way to respond. There's a whole host of ways that you could respond to street epistemology. One of the ways is to actually study the historical evidence for Christianity and to respond that way. Hey, actually, my belief is based on evidence, and it's based on the historical evidence. There's several ways that you could go. You could challenge their epistemological assumptions. You could say, hey, my belief is actually based on testimony. There's a whole host of ways that you could go. And I'm not personally telling anybody, do this. You have to do this one thing. I'm saying, here's the way that I respond. You can make of it what you will and look into it further and then figure out the way that you want to go.
Yeah. Good. All right. Chris has a question here. A high level of certainty isn't required to have faith. Did he really say this? If you're asking me, yes, I think that's correct. A high level of certainty is not required in order to have a reliable belief about something, or, depending on how you're defining faith, to have trust in something. So thank you for the question, Chris. But yeah, that's right. I don't think we need to have tautological certainty about some beliefs out there. And by a tautology, I mean something that's, we know with 100% certainty. So, good question. Jonathan has a follow-up, and I'm happy we're engaging here with our live listeners. What would all say to the form of atheism that states it's the default position and it's just a lack of belief? Cameron, I'm sure you've dealt with this before. What do you think?
I kind of run away from those people because those discussions devolve really quickly. I try to avoid the terms as best I can. So instead of asking, are you an atheist? How do you define yourself? I instead will ask something like, do you believe that God exists? And if they say no, then we could go further. So I just sort of avoid that question. But I think, can you repeat what he asked? He was asking about if atheism is the default position. And I would need to get some more clarity on what is supposed to be meant by that. Default in what way?
Yeah, so some atheists talk about how we're kind of just born atheists and people are raised believing religious things. So that atheism is default insofar as it's, with regard to the burden of proof and those sorts of issues.
Okay. Burden of proof, I think, is different than whether or not, like, psychologically speaking, people would just be atheists if there were no religion around. I've actually done some research into that. There's this thing called the indoctrination hypothesis, which is a false hypothesis. It's an attempt to explain religious belief in terms of, hey, everybody was just indoctrinated into their beliefs. Otherwise, atheism would be widespread. That would be the position that people would hold naturally. And there's a lot of sociological evidence that suggests that actually kids, and maybe that was the wrong term, psychological evidence, I don't know. There's evidence that children, it doesn't matter where, from America, China, wherever, children have a innate propensity to believe in the supernatural. And not even just in a supernatural, but in like a super knower, like an all-powerful super knower and maybe one of those properties is incorrect there. But nevertheless, to say that there's no evidence at all that would suggest that if there weren't this kind of indoctrination, that there would be no religious belief. That was one part of the thing that you brought up, and then the second part I forget.
The atheism as the lack of belief.
Okay.
So the problem with that one is that rocks are then atheists because rocks lack a belief. So I don't. That's why I don't take that to be a good definition of atheism, because when we're talking to people, they certainly do have actual beliefs that God does not exist, or if it's an agnostic, they're not sure if God exists. It's not. You were
talking about the burden of proof and like who has the burden in this case. And I'm actually putting together a list right now of apologetics terms for beginners. Burden of proof is one of the ones that I just went through. And so burden of proof is basically anyone who makes a claim, you are then burdened to defend that claim. And so if an atheist, whatever they actually believe, if they say or claim that God does not exist, that's a claim that they've made, and they are then burdened to defend that claim. And the same is true of Christians. If a Christian says, by the way, Christianity is true, I then am burdened to defend that. And normally, like I said, when I post that or put it anywhere, I usually defend that claim with some evidence. So that's the basic rundown of burden of proof. There's no like automatic get out of burden proof card. So
cool. I see we've got more comments and questions now flying in, and I want to thank those that are contributing online. Unfortunately, we've run short on our time today. Cameron, before we let you go, where can people learn more about this?
If they want to learn more about street epistemology and the way that I respond, I actually did a discussion. This was a written exchange, actually. That's the kind of thing that I prefer when I'm doing an exchange with a street epistemologist on these subjects. I like to really sit down and think through my responses. That's one of the things that works in the street epistemologist favor, is that they're relying on someone to just think up whatever they can think on the spot. And that's not always the best way to go about these sort of intellectual questions. But anyways, I did a conversation with a street epistemologist. You can see that on my website. It's called My Conversation with a Street Epistemologist. And there's actually a drop down here on my website. If you go to topics, you can see street epistemology, all the stuff, all the articles that I've written tagged on that. I've done an interview critiquing street epistemology more generally on the podcast Hey Pastor. So yeah, that's where you can go if you want to learn more about the way that I respond. If you want to learn more about capturing Christianity, just go to my website.
You've got some great interviews with Christian philosophers, maybe just Christian philosophers. I'm not sure if you've gone outside of philosophy. Perhaps you have. At any rate, who are some upcoming apologists that you have on your interviewing schedule?
Let me actually pull the list up because it's a big list. And we're going to be filming interviews with basically every top apologist in the world, almost every single one of them. So here's the list. William Lane Craig, Douglas Groothuis, Gary Habermas, J.P. Moreland, who I know you're having on soon, Greg Koukl, next week, Greg Koukl, J. Warner Wallace, I think you're having him on again
2 weeks
soon too, David Baggett, who's a great Christian philosopher, and then John McCrae, who some people know. He's a Christian YouTuber.
What do you mean?
What do you mean? So, yeah, and then I think we're going to be probably filling in a couple more slots there, maybe even with Kurt, if he's going to be there. But, yeah, so that's what we're doing. We're filming these at the upcoming EPS conference. All of these guys are going to be in attendance at this conference, and so I figured this is the perfect time to film some interviews with these guys. If you want to see the way that our interviews look, I did an interview with, I think I mentioned it earlier, Richard Swinburne. You can find that on my website, or you can search on YouTube my interview with Richard Swinburne. So, yeah, that's what we plan on doing. We're going to be interviewing the top apologists. It's going to be really great stuff. I mean, what my ministry is all about is bringing sort of the level of the aesthetics to apologetics, making sure that the presentation side of things, in addition to like the philosophical side, I'm really, I think you can kind of tell that's where my focus is in the philosophy, making sure that side of things is rigorous, well taken care of. But I also want the aesthetics to be there as well. I think that's something when a person first sees some content on social media and it's poorly done or the lighting looks bad, I think that plays a part psychologically in whether or not they're going to be open to it and click on it and listen to the content. So that's what we want to do with the ministry more generally, but also with these interviews. And so I'm actually also, I can mention this. When we're shooting these interviews, I'm going to be taking their portraits as well. I'm actually working on a book where I'm going to sort of put all of these apologists, the interviews or the portraits that I've taken, talk about their ministry, what they've meant to me personally. And that's something that I'm working on. Hopefully everybody's on board with that and we can make that a reality. But that's another goal with these interviews, is to sort of put something together like that.
Nice.
But anyways, thanks for asking.
Of course, yeah, awesome. And I'm sure you'll probably stick on the line here while I close up the program. So great chatting with you, Cameron. I've got a couple... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to thank you for inviting me on.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks. I've got a couple comments I want to talk about before closing out the program. Just first here, I see Chris Smith here has commented online something that I want to address, and then I've got another thing to talk about. He says here, indoctrination is a real thing, and religion would dry up without it. Well, indoctrination is a real thing, but unfortunately, the attribution to simply religion is a too narrow of a claim, Chris. Why don't you say also that indoctrination is a real thing and that history would dry up without it, or indoctrination is a real thing and science would dry up without it. It would set back science, the field of science, for generations, if not more, if people didn't learn and we didn't teach people about these fields. So I don't think that calling out religion per se is a fair assessment. Let's look for some consistency here. In fact, religion is very useful for humanity. It's useful for the human soul. It isn't just practical, but accurately reflects what we see in reality. There's an objective grounding to it. So I think that just calling out religion there, I want to see some more consistency from some of these folks out there. All right, so that's what I want to say to that comment from Chris. Lastly, about last week's episode with Craig Evans. What a fun time. What a brilliant guy. There was some fascinating discussion on my personal Facebook profile over this interview. And one of my Facebook friends was able to share with me how one of the questions I asked Evans wasn't as clear as I had hoped it to be. And that was a question about Lydia McGrew's statements about Evans. So I actually wrote an email to Evans in follow-up because I just wanted to confirm. There was one thing Evans said in his answer that I interpreted to mean talking about the text. So my question was whether Lydia's critique of him was fair, that Jesus goes, quote, on and on for many verses, end quote. And by that, Lydia meant or has interpreted that Jesus goes on uninterrupted. And is that sort of really what Evans believes, that Jesus gives these monologues where he's uninterrupted? So I asked this question to Evans through email. Do you believe that John's portrayal of Jesus, not the historical Jesus, in the I Am discourses is of a monologuing Jesus? And here was his answer. He says, I do find this monologuing question odd. The evangelist John has created discourses in which Jesus is portrayed as speaking, almost as in a monologue. Even so, Jesus rarely goes on for more than 2 or 3 paragraphs before someone asks a question and Jesus replies. The Johannine discourses could be described as monologues, but only in qualified, limited sense. Now, the important thing to gather from this answer is that he clearly recognizes that Jesus is interrupted with a question or an objection from the Pharisees, or a question from his disciple. He's engaging in dialogue. It's like he's teaching. He's maybe giving a lecture. But does that mean that he is speaking in a monologue? Well, not quite. It's a little tricky, but I mean, not in substance, as we might understand a monologue, like, say, the State of the Union address that a president gives. That would be a monologue. And Jesus is not doing that, and Evans doesn't recognize Jesus as doing that, going on uninterrupted. So I think that the criticism brought toward Evans's view there is unwarranted upon seeking clarification. So for those of you that have been following along with that, I've actually written a final blog post while I focus on other things. Some other things have come up in my life that have keeping me busy. So I'll be taking a break from writing on that topic for now. But I would love to hear if you want me to do some writing and research on some other topic. Please let me know. Happy to receive that input. Okay, that does it for our program today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons. Those are folks that just chip in a couple bucks a month, and we would love to get your support for this program. I'm also grateful for the partnerships that we have with our sponsors, Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Fox Restoration, and Nonprofit Megaphone. And I want to thank our technical producer, Chris, and AJ sitting in as well. Hopefully we'll see him next week. And I want to thank our guest, Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity. We'll be sure to put a link over at our website to his website. And last but not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.